So I want to kick off this series of lectures here by looking at a common analogy that you'll see both economists as well as policy makers make about the constraints that the federal government has. This analogy is essentially to say that the government faces the same financial constraints that anybody else does, that any other household or business does. And this argument stems from that traditional story of money that we've covered previously. In that story, money developed to reduce transaction costs. Initially, money was some commodity like gold that had intrinsic value. Eventually, paper money and fiat money could be introduced, but money still works as if it were gold, with value varying inversely with quantity. The policy implications of that traditional story of money holds that for the government to spend, then, it has to get that money that it's going to spend from somebody. It could, of course, print the money, but in this view, recall that quantity equation MV equals PY with the assumptions in neoclassical economics that V and Y are stable. And in that case, then, printing the money, which means increasing M, can only increase prices, P, which is another way of saying devaluing the currency. So how does the government get the money? Well, there are basically two ways of going about acquiring that money. The most obvious, of course, is taxes, but there are downsides to that. The biggest one is that every dollar collected in taxes for the government to spend is a dollar the taxpayer no longer has to spend. So to the extent that taxes would have been spent anyway, the government spending really just crowded out, as we say, private spending. The other option the government has to get that money is to borrow it, to issue bonds, to jack up the national debts. But of course, there are downsides here too. Remember, in the neoclassical model, this additional borrowing means an increased demand in the loanable funds markets. As you'll recall, an increased demand in any markets raises the price, and in the loanable funds market, that means an increased interest rate. Now, if interest rates are higher, what's that going to do to investment spending? Of course, higher interest rates means it's more expensive to borrow, which means there's going to be less investment spending. So what this is arguing then is that if the government borrows the money, that will only increase interest rates and effectively crowd out some private investment spending. In the most extreme example of this view of government finances, there are arguments that go something along these lines. If taxpayers see that the government will eventually have to raise taxes to pay off the debt incurred through borrowing the money, they might actually start saving for those higher taxes today, and this is going to further crowd out private spending. This view, of course, can lead to some extreme policy positions, expansionary austerity being one of them. The arguments of expansionary austerity hold that even in a recession, government should actually cut spending and or increase taxes. This is the complete opposite of the traditional Keynesian approach to a recession. This, some economists argue, will promote confidence among investors as well as consumers that the government has committed itself to responsible finances. Then, as a result, investment and consumption spending will increase, which of course means aggregate demand increases, which will increase output and income and decrease unemployment, driving us out of the recession through the opposite of that traditional Keynesian approach of government spending or tax cuts. So what you'll often hear from this general standpoint of money and the constraints that governments face is that the government works essentially the same way you or I or any household or firm does. I can spend more than I take in over some period of time by issuing debt, which is to say by taking out loans, maybe credit card loans or mortgages or what have you, and this might even be a good thing. It's better to pay off a mortgage over 30 years and have a house that you own than to pay rents for 30 years and not own any house at the end of it. But can I spend more than I make indefinitely? Of course not. Higher debt means lower credit score, which means higher interest rates on additional borrowing, and eventually either people are going to stop lending to me or my debt payments are going to get so large that I won't be able to repay them and I'll have to default. The argument here then is that governments face essentially the same problem as you or I or households or firms or what have you. Running deficits increases the national debt of the government, so running large prolonged deficits can eventually lead to economic disaster. In political discourse, this view can take a hawkish or a dovish form. Deficit hawks believe the government should always balance its budget every year, or else inflation or higher interest rates or the national debt burdening future generations or economic disaster or what have you. Deficit doves, on the other hand, then suggest that deficits might be okay if offset by surpluses during expansions. The basic argument here is why balance the budget over an arbitrary 12 months based on how long it takes the planet to circle its star? These deficit doves would argue instead, why not balance the budget over, say, the business cycle, running deficits in the recessionary periods and then repaying that debt by running surpluses in the expansion? Another dovish argument is, just as it may be wise for a household to borrow money, say, to buy a house, and then repay that debts over time, it might also be appropriate for the government to run deficits when doing so would be good for the economy, and then repay that debt later when the economy is already doing well.